when you hear it come up in the news or somebody is addressing it to you, or you're going to vote at the ballot box for a particular candidate, you might be conservative on a list of issues, but then climate change, you're like, yeah, but it does seem like there are more tornadoes and they're getting worse, and we need to put money toward, fighting climate change. No, you don't. You need to educate yourself on what the issue is and whether or not this is actually happening. Welcome to another episode of For Liberty and Justice, where we will seek to mobilize the church, wake up the city, and take a stand for liberty and justice. My name is Joshua Moore. I'm your host today with this podcast episode, and we are so excited to talk about an issue and really a topic in our country that is heavy on us, but the church doesn't talk about this enough, frankly, and that is the issue of climate change. Now, I want to start off real quick before we get in and introduce our guest. We hold the position that it is not man-caused. And we also are going to talk about the show, like why that is, but also why it matters to the church, why it should matter to the church, and why the church should be at least somewhat focused on this issue. And we're going to dispel some myths. So we're going to talk a little bit, some facts and some really interesting things that probably affect you, especially those in the Great Plains and in Dixie Alley and the Ohio Valley Alley. These are all different tornado alleys that exist. But before we get into that, I want to introduce my guest, who actually happens to be my father, Ron Moore Jr. And so thanks for coming down. I appreciate it. Looking forward to having you on here.
Good to be here. Excited about it, man. It's good topic to talk about. One of my most exciting ones to discuss. And you're right. It's relevant to everybody, including the church, and it's all over the Bible.
So before we get into this, Dad, kind of give a brief background, as far as what you've done in the past with weather and really why people should be listening to you and myself on the show about this topic.
Okay. So, yeah, there's two tracks in my life, as you know, but some of it predates you. I grew up in West Texas, grew up loving weather and tornadoes. And as a young person in the early 80s, I started being a Skywarn spotter, kind of evolved, and then I got more into it, became a chaser. Then I went into ministry. I was a youth pastor on and off in different churches in the South, also a praise leader. So I had a lot of work in different churches. Then we moved to Tallahassee. I ended up going there to start a new church, and I went back to Florida State to learn meteorology, study meteorology. So I got my undergrad meteorology there. We stuck around longer as that church work grew. As you remember, we had a massive youth center, just all kinds of cool things happening there. And I got my master's degree in hurricane climatology. And so from there, we took people out to the Great Plains, some scientists to study tornadoes. So my chasing for years had evolved to that point to also being a researcher. Did some work with FEMA, with the insurance industry, Department of Defense. We did some digital atlases with it for hurricanes. So it was a lot of activity all centered around specifically hurricanes and also tornadoes, which I really enjoyed. Didn't get into blizzards until I moved to New England, and I love snow and all that, as you know. But so that carried it there. Then we moved to up here 20 years ago. I've had the storm warning going, which is my own private business since then, which is forecasting, but also educating people on extreme weather, kind of how to be prepared for it, ready for it. While at the same time, we had a church plant up here, which we still have the ministry up here in New England. But the parallel tracks have run all the time together, ministry and meteorology. It's fascinating how much meteorology was started by men and women of God that had faith in God in the scripture. That's the basis of the world of meteorology and climatology, by the way.
Yeah, that's great. And it's also interesting to know that when we were growing up, we actually started in the year 2000 chasing tornadoes as a family. And that kind of grew into an annual vacation trip that was a lot of fun. But in doing so, we learned a lot about severe weather and extreme weather, which happens to line up, or at least come in alignment with some of the political topics that are thriving today, like climate change. Yeah. And it's really ravaged the church too. And so I want to start off by talking a little bit about why does this matter to the church? Why should it matter to the church, Dad? Because a lot of people are in the church are if they're focused on this issue of climate change, they're concerned about it. And there's not a lot of conservative thought regarding this issue. And there's not a lot of Christians really even talking about this. That's why I think we're bringing it up on this show is a really unique perspective. So let's talk about that, you being a pastor in that point of view.
Yeah. A very interesting way to put it and an interesting perspective. And yes, extremely important. And I'll take it this route. This show is about liberty and justice. Justice is not being served in America, hasn't been for a number of decades because of how we define weather and storms and hurricanes and tornadoes and wind damage. We just experienced that in Florida, Western North Carolina. Floridians couldn't believe they weren't covered for certain things in these hurricanes and stuff. And we won't even get into hurricanes increasing or not, or maybe we will later. But people are being done wrong financially by the insurance industry, the governments, all these different entities who have taken climate change and weaponized it, for a better word, against the people. Florida's a great example of what happened this year. And another thing that happened, the urban planning was so poorly done in most cities like Tampa Bay. I used to tell you and Caleb 20 years ago, I said, if somebody went into legal action against the climate change zealots, the people who've been pushing what really is a propaganda, I hate to say it. Now, climate changes. That's scientific. It does change over time and seasons. That's a normal thing. You have to adjust to that. We're talking about what they call anthropogenic or man-made climate change, i.e. your muffler, your CO2, your electricity, all that causing these things to happen. That's what we don't believe has a hand in this, at least nothing to the magnitude what they claim. So people are being hurt. People in your area right now due to tornadoes versus wind damage would be hurt by insurance policies, the way they're set, the way they're worded. So it distinctly affects people of every brand, doesn't matter what color, creed, where they live, it affects them. And since the church has all these people in it, and so we're also supposed to care about the community at large around us, we have a hand to be involved in these types of things.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think it matters also to the church in large part because climate change and this whole issue is really rooted in paganism, right? If you go back to the Old Testament and we look at, the worship of creation and we look at the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth and all these gods, I mean, every single time it came back down to the worship of creation, the trees, the rocks, building images and carved images. And I mean, all through the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, this is shown. And I think that's where the church will tend to look at this and go, oh, that's not that big of a deal as an issue. Well, aside from the fact that we'll get into this a little bit, aside from the fact that, which you've already covered, by the way, that it costs money and it affects every single person that is hit by hail from your home to your car and everything. It also affects us spiritually because we're pointing to creation as the God and not the creator. We're looking at And the reason why I say that is because we often look at government to solve the problem, which is one thing we look down on today. We, especially with our team for Liberty and Justice, we always point people to the fact that government is not the answer. Some things it's the answer because government exists for a reason, according to Romans chapter 13, but it is not the answer when it comes to creation.
Right.
We are to steward our planet with excellence in good stewardship, but we are not supposed to worship creation. And that's what we're doing when we posit that creation is governed by our actions, and it's not. And in this particular case, with storms supposedly getting worse, that's just not the case. And we're going to dispel some of that. But can you speak to a little bit of that? Yeah.
Well, again, I think you laid it out. You were talking about the church and why we don't recognize the problem. And I've known many pastors in my life because I've been a senior pastor for 25 years now plus, and I've been in ministry for 35 years. I've dealt with pastors over and again. They say, well, I can appreciate, the weather and stuff, but I don't think science really has a place in church. And that's not true. All of science was birthed by Christian people. The church is not a building. It's Christian people together, collectively working. That is the church. So the church is what gave birth to all the sciences, including meteorology. And I'll throw a name out there real quick. Elias Loomis was a professor in the early 1800s at Yale University. He learned to connect the dots of atmospheric pressure. We call it a weather map today. And he's the guy who first came up with that, and it led to a few others forming it over the next 20 or 30 years. And he said God gave him those ideas, taking order out of chaos. He said weather can't be chaotic. So they began to figure this stuff out because they believed the scripture, which taught order and not chaos to things, which gave us the world of modern meteorology. As you know, I could give you a list of meteorologists through time who were born again believers, strong men and women both, who were involved in these processes. Then the church gave that up. We come to climate change. You nailed it. It's a pagan belief, dates back to the Old Testament and many of the pagan rituals, all the way back to actually the sun god of Egypt, which Israel had a problem ditching, So these things all through history, but we've come back that way. And I've used this term over the last 10 years. You could blow civilization out of the water by going back to this stuff. Jeremiah said you worship a tree during the day and you burn it at night for a campfire. It's exactly how we do it. I could use an instance right now. The Tesla cars, which are very, very popular for years for helping people and everything, suddenly everybody's against them and getting rid of them and stuff. Well, do you believe in what you say or do you not believe in what you say? So there's so much tied into this thread. The climate change literally affects everything because it affects how you dress in the morning. It affects how you prep your energy costs, all that other stuff. And it has a direct, going back full circle to what we were saying in the beginning, it affects people's energy needs, consumption, gasoline, electricity. All these things are affected, and they all have to do with justice.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I like what you said, and we've kind of been talking about this for the last few minutes, that it's not climate change itself being presented as though it's being caused by man, but the issue or the belief that it's being caused by man and that it's an existential threat is what is the issue. And that's what's causing us. The lie itself is causing people to freak out and to vote certain policies and favor certain policies. And when we say vote in favor of certain policies, we're not talking about a ballot initiative. We're talking about voting for congressmen and senators and governors whose main priority it is to present hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars to fight an issue that is not occurring. Yep. That's the problem. And it's like a lot of other things that we're doing. We're fighting everything else. But this climate change issue has become a religion to the left. It has become a real problem. And frankly speaking, and it's why we're talking about this right now, it's become a problem in the church. There's so many Christians who are not familiar with the issue. They go, the climate change thing, CO2 levels. And I want to get into that a little bit now because I think a lot of people get wrapped up around, they're told two things. Number one, CO2 levels are off the charts, and then they get wrapped up in this whole CO2 level thing and frankly speaking, terminology that most people do not use in their everyday life. So it's a very confusing conversation, number one. But also number two, on that same note, they're also told that storms are getting worse, that they're increasing in severity and quantity, that hurricanes are doing more destruction now and becoming bigger and worse and more and faster and more hard hitting than ever before. Same for tornadoes. Yeah. So let's lead off with that. Let's talk about the facts behind that. Like, what does that look like? Because I think a lot of people right now are, especially what just happened in the Southeast, from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Missouri, just got ravaged by twisters last week. Yeah. And when this show airs, it'll probably be like 2 weeks ago. But we are just now getting into tornado season, and it's going to ramp up, just like it does, by the way, every year. Speak into that.
Yep. So I'll take the first one first, CO2, and do it quick because I've got science buddies, and some of them personally yourselves. They're friends of yours too. Up here that are very strong opponents of the CO2 argument. And they can go into massive detail, parts per million and all that. And sometimes I'm sitting there going, wow, I mean, I understand what they're saying, but I'm like, how do you explain this to people, So I'll keep it simple this way. CO2, what they say is that temperature follows CO2. As CO2 increases, the temperature is allowed to go up. What I believe and what many others believe is it's the reverse. Is that actually CO2 is following temperature. Temperature is going up, but CO2 is not causing it. CO2 is just rising with the temperature. So if anything else, temperature is causing CO2. Well, how do you stop that? Well, you can't. That's insane. Because we know the solar activity, the sun and the sunspots and all the other things are happening. So the reverse is actually the opposite of what they've been claiming with CO2. And I'll add this in too. Before you were born, way back when I was young, and even predates me, we had smog in the cities. That was fog and smoke together. That was the mufflers. There was nothing to stop it. It was just pumping into the air. I've got pictures of it in New York. It was hideous. Acid rain, which is rain mixing in with chemicals, was real. There was some stuff like that happened. We shut that stuff down. In 15 years, we crippled it. It was awesome. It was private companies, some government, but they did a good job. Then the climate change thing took over. Hey, if we got that much power over this, let's do even more. So we moved into the whole CO2 argument, which is a very spurious argument, which takes us into, leaving that one now, into the increase of extreme weather. And I was telling you, I was in this tornado outbreak because I chase these things. I was in Missouri and Arkansas. I was there when Poplar Bluff got hit. In fact, people can go to the videos online and see that stuff. But they keep changing the numbers, which is a little weird because, Storm Prediction Center used to update within 24 hours. They had everything counted. And they said now it just takes forever to do it. I'm like, well, how did they do it back 20 years ago so quick then? I don't get that, And you got better technology now. So they've been adding in, I think the last count is 85 or 90 tornadoes last Friday, okay? That was considered historic, off the charts. About the same number the next day, a few less. That was just totally off the charts. You and I were in Kansas, probably, 11 or 13? I don't remember which year. You probably remember the year.
2008.
Was it? Okay. So we're out there and we had 87 tornadoes. Remember that in 6 hours in 9 counties. So we had more or as many tornadoes in just a fraction of the time in a tiny area than we had the other day last Friday. Last Friday was bad. It was not historic at that level, what we call historic. So people use this terminology, and another word we use is unprecedented. These things are just not unprecedented. There's not been an F5 tornado, okay? Not been one of those since 2013. So now we're going into our 12th year. Will we get one this year? Maybe. But so much of that stuff is subjective to how they survey damage and stuff like that. Here's another point too, Josh. When you're hit by a tornado, all these arguments kind of fly out the window because your town is now ravaged and damaged and hurt from it, and you just want help. You don't want to debate climate change. You want help. People who are proponents of climate change, and I was part of this when I studied it at Florida State working with FEMA, would say, if you didn't believe in it to begin with, why should we help you? Because you weren't even believing in climate change. And if people are like, what are you nailing down on us now? No, we just need help. That's what we want right now. So it can be weaponized, as we've seen the last 10 years, big time weaponized. That's why climate change, if you want to believe it, that's fine. But you can't implement all your government policy, insurance policy, regulations on energy, transportation, all that other stuff. Heathrow Airport got closed down yet today. I don't know if you heard about it. They shut down Europe. They may be closed for a few days. A fire started. No storm at all, just a big fire. So there's a lot of things can shut things down other than a tornado or hurricane. Here, that's what we focus on. But this, like you said, we're in that season. This stuff is quote, normal. And where we're at today with technology and understanding of stuff, we should be able to respond to this stuff so well. We are saving lives. Lives are being saved, and I believe that's because there's chasers on the ground, actually, like we've done, intercepting this stuff ahead of time, letting the National Weather Service know, 5, 10, 20 minutes ahead of time. That stuff's awesome. And I love that improvement.
Yeah. And to that point, we just found out a few months ago, right before the election, that after Hurricane Irene, was it Irene or was the last one that hit Florida? I'm trying to remember something, or Helene. Was it Helene?
Helene. Yep.
Helene. There we go. You were in that one as well, by the way.
Yep.
I know. The FEMA got in trouble for skipping Trump supporters' households. If you had a Trump sign in your yard, they were told very specifically and directly, skip the homes with the Trump signs in their yard.
Yeah.
And so Trump has mentioned time and time again that he's not necessarily sure where he stands on climate change, but he doesn't believe that we should be a part of the Paris Climate Accords because we're getting ripped off. And so that kind of goes to the whole point. Yeah, absolutely. But I've noticed a lot of conservative political pundits and commentators have avoided this issue directly and really kind of tiptoe around it. They go, we're not really sure. So we know that it's probably not a wise thing to get involved in. So let's stop spending money. Here at For Liberty and Justice, we're trying to dig deep into it and explain to you, give you a very unique point of view as an organization and a ministry, and saying, here are the facts of this particular topic that you're not hearing from any other conservative commentator. You're not hearing from an organization or political, whatever it may be. Yeah. We're here to dispel these things. And so, Dad, to your point, I got some facts here. This is all from the Storm Prediction Center.
Oh, yeah.
NOAA, which is the National
Oceanic.
That's
good
right.
Information.
All of it. It says over the past decade from 2013 to 2023, 6 of those 10 years, so that 60% of that decade were at or below average for annual tornadoes. And the average for tornadoes annually is 1,229.6, right? So for only 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2023 were above average. 2014, 2017, and 2021 were below average, and the other remaining years were at average. So this idea, just with tornadoes strictly over the from that little decade on, 2013 to 2023, we were below average for tornadoes. And you pointed something else out, the last EF5. And for those who are not aware of what an EF5 is, tornadoes are measured by the damage that they do. Unlike a hurricane, which is measured by its wind speed, tornadoes can't be because they're too violent. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dad, but they're just too violent.
Hard to get an instrument to path them. It's very hard.
That's right, because they just rip them up.
They're trying to. But
they are trying. Yep, that's exactly. Shout out to Reed Timmer. But with that said, so you have the F scale, which actually changed, correct me if I'm wrong, in February of 2007. It changed to EF scale, enhanced Fujita, and they brought in a number of different other factors, which in fact lowered the threshold for a tornado to achieve an EF 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Even with the lowered threshold, and so let's make it a little bit easier for people to understand. If an EF5 starts at, if an F5 started at 200 miles an hour, I'm just throwing out numbers here, then an EF5 might start at 170 miles an hour. So you see it goes from 200 to now 170. All right. And so that threshold is lowered. Even with the lowered threshold of an EF5, we still cannot have not measured an EF5 since 2013. That is what's flabbergasting. And I don't think anybody really thinks about it like that.
Not only that, tornadoes, the science of tornadoes is still really infant. So when they're changing numbers around and EF scales and stuff, Dr. Fujita, we got the F scale from, Fujita's named after him. That guy put a ton of time into this stuff. He flew all over the world, documented everything. I think most of our guys just look at computer models all day long and crunch a few numbers. I mean, these guys did field work, went out and did it. It'll give you these numbers too. So what did you say the average for tornadoes is right now per year? Average?
I hadn't gotten there yet, but there were 59 F5/EF5 tornadoes between 1950 and 2013. That was the last since the last EF5 we had. In 63 years, the United States has averaged just under one EF5 or F5 since then. In the last 10 years, we've had 0.
So but the average number of tornadoes, period, 1,200 something, I think.
Oh, yeah, 1229, correct.
So Sergeant John Finley was in the military in the early 1860s. He's the first guy to study tornadoes. I've got a lot of his stuff. One of his books I'd love to get. I can't find it. I've got his other. Very cool guy. Anyhow, he documented tornadoes back then and found there to be about 550 to 600 tornadoes a year. Okay. This is when they had stagecoaches. This predates even the trains really going like crazy. I mean, the trains were beginning to develop. This is around just before the Civil War time. So we have doubled tornadoes since the 1860s. We find double the number from then. With all the increase of technology, cars, planes, trains, everything, phones and satellites and radars and chasers, thousands of chasers. No one chased back then. You had a horse. We've only got double the number of tornadoes in 150 years.
It's a very good point.
That's so staggering. That means it was probably a very violent period back then. And actually, through history, and you know this, I have a massive collection of old books, photographs. I could have brought them out here for everybody, but dating back to the 1800s, where they're catching pictures of massive tornadoes on the ground in 1890, real photographs. Well, they didn't hardly have many cameras back then. How are they doing it? They're doing it because they were pretty prolific. We have cameras all over the place today, and you know this pretty well. It's really hard to get some good shots of some tornadoes. They're using rain wrapped, or they're moving too quick, or by the time you get your camera set up, it flew past you. I'm just saying, and they did this at Florida State. We did some kind of analysis. It wasn't real deep, but it was, cursor analysis, I guess you would call elementary stuff. And Dr. Elsner, we were running numbers, and he would say, so you think because of increased people and cameras and chasers, that's why we're finding more tornadoes? I'm like, of course. That's like the way you had a flood surge in Florida is somebody has a house built there. If it's just woods,
that's correct.
It hits. That's just insane to me. That goes more into social sciences, but there's a point there to be made for them. So they've taken all these numbers of storms, which are really cool, and we won't even get into the God's creation part of it and broken physics and all that other stuff. I also believe this. I got to say this. I believe as believers, we have a certain authority to pray into situations and certainly get the counsel and wisdom of God how to respond to these things. There's no need for you and your family to be afraid of this, because I believe God wants to protect his people and will either give you information and advice how to avoid it or potentially even pray against it. And I'll say that. That doesn't sound very sciencey, but there's a lot of scripture, lots of stories in the Bible where people are involved in meteorology and weather. In fact,
one of the most prominent places in Scripture was when Jesus is on the boat with his disciples and tells the winds to be still, and they stood still, right? People think that that's just some cute Bible story, though, and it's true. It happened.
Every book of the Bible has weather in it. Every book. Even Ruth is about a famine. The whole book's about a famine. Then you have Job, the book of Job. He's talking to twisters. That's where the end of the book is. I call it talking twisters. And he said God spoke out of the whirlwind to him. That's been one of my themes, chasing tornadoes. I said God speaks to me when I'm out there. He may speak to you cutting tomatoes. He may speak to another guy putting a new carburetor in his car. For me, he talks to me when I'm on a storm. I was just out last week and God said a whole bunch of stuff. I'll be sharing it Sunday. I mean, I think God can use things, even things that look bad, he can turn around for good. So my point is, people don't need to be afraid of this stuff. They need to be prepared and ready, like anybody would be, have your generator, stuff like that. But at the same time, say, God, is there something I need to know more here, or something I need to pray about? So that's the spiritual aspect I give to it, to not be afraid of these things because they're real. You need to be aware of them, but the world is not falling apart in that way. Again, weather's actually been really good to us for the last 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Food production through the roof.
For sure. And I think you brought up a really good point, because this is something that I've chatted with people in the past about. And that's the social aspect of not only storm chasing, but severe weather observation across the board. We've been keeping more detailed track, I would say, or if you want to even say it this way, we've had our governmental entity set up like NOAA, Storm Prediction Center, even if they weren't known as that back then, really since the 1950s is when we started keeping track. Then Ted Fujita came out in the 1970s and tracked his first tornado, which I believe was Xenia, Ohio, F5 tornado back then. So you've got this development of entities that start to follow tornado action and development. And then beyond that, we had a lesser population, fewer people in the United States of America back then. Sure. We also have this one thing that I personally believe has completely changed storm chasing and more specifically and importantly, storm observation, which affects the perspective we have on whether or not storms are getting worse and increasing more, which is social media. Social media didn't even exist until MySpace, right. And even that was limited. So really it didn't exist for reporting purposes, if you want to call it that, until Facebook. And that wasn't until the year I basically graduated high school in 2008. So I would say 2002, 2007 and 8 was the advent of social media. And that really wasn't that long ago. I mean, now we're talking I'm going to age ourselves here. I guess 17 years ago, we were almost approaching the 20-year mark of social media. Dad, we cannot in good conscience say that storms are increasing and getting worse when we've only been reporting them on social media for 20 years nearly. Right. Yep. And that really exacerbates the numbers because like we've kind of not jokingly, we've actually talked about it. Like Grandma Gigi might be driving with her husband at 80 years of age on their RV through, Wyoming in the state in the month of July, which is typically when tornadoes break out there, June and July. And then all of a sudden they spot a twister that 30 years ago would have never been seen before because no one lived out there, no one traveled out there or whatever it may be. And that really does matter. That affects our observation and what's reported.
Well, not only that, again, going back to the insurance and not to throw them under the bus because insurance can be done so well in America. They have done it well at times through American history. Insurance has been crafted very, very well for people and for companies. Not so much right now because when they're claiming climate change and they say they buy into it, they're not telling the truth. The insurance companies are much stronger. The actuarials, these guys know how to cut stats, data, everything. They know this isn't true. But if they can say, well, you're at a higher risk of being hit by a hurricane in Florida, Florida has what they call return periods of hurricanes, how often they come back. And I tell people Miami hadn't been hit in a long time. Miami, up until I think 1970, somewhere in there, maybe the 60s, had been hit by a hurricane every third year. For decades, They got hit. That's why they didn't grow. They couldn't build anything. So now you go 20, 30 years, hey, it's not happening. If Miami starts getting hit and going underwater again, climate change, insurance will say blah, blah, blah. The West Coast did not get hit typically. It's been the last 6, 7 years the West Coast is getting hammered by hurricanes. That is exceptionally rare, but it's also cyclical. These things run in cycles. Sometimes they're a yearly short-term cycle. Sometimes they're decadal, what is called decades, like 1, 2, 3 decades. So again, it's sad that people don't have time to run down all these numbers. It's like me working on certain things around my house. I don't have time. I have to get an expert to come in and tell me we got to have a stove installed. It'll have to be the next week or two. It's gas, so the expert has to come in and do it. I won't have a clue what they're doing. I have to trust them. So people are trusting insurance and government to do the right thing, and they're not doing it. They know what they're doing is right. The church has an obligation to at least offer classes or some input. You don't have to do a whole sermon. Just do a 5 minutes. Say, by the way, if you're interested in how they would frame it. Some churches, yours particularly, is a little more bold on that, like we are. But it has to be addressed. The church has to talk about it because it's
absolutely
of truth.
That's exactly right. Truth. It all goes back to the Bible. Yeah. And that's why we exist as For Liberty and Justice, is to, on every single issue that is a cultural or biblical justice issue, climate change is one of them, to point it back to the Bible and then dispel myths about it. Yep. Or whether it's a lie or a truth, we need to talk about it and explain it to people and let people know here's why you need to be not even necessarily focused on the issue, but when you hear it come up in the news or somebody is addressing it to you, or you're going to vote at the ballot box for a particular candidate, you might be conservative on a list of issues, but then climate change, you're like, yeah, but it does seem like there are more tornadoes and they're getting worse, and we need to put money toward fighting climate change. No, you don't. You need to educate yourself on what the issue is and whether or not this is actually happening. Yep. Is it man-caused? Which we are, of course, arguing from the position that it is not man-caused. It is a religion. It is a pagan religion rooted in paganism, and we should be addressing it as such, which also means being financially responsible. But let's also talk about something, because we have a little bit of time here left. I want to go into hurricanes, because we talked a little bit about tornadoes now. Let's talk about hurricanes, because I know that that's also one of your areas of expertise and specialty, particularly when you were in college.
Right.
And here's the bottom line, Dad. Here's the question. Are hurricanes increasing and getting worse?
No and no, and I could show you the same data you're talking about from the National Hurricane Center would prove that out. The line goes down slightly, okay? No, they're not. Something very interesting a few years ago, there's a lot of debate about this. They did a reanalysis project. Some of the people involved in it, I worked with at Florida State. They were at the Hurricane Center, but we corresponded from my data, from my work on my master's thesis. There are now heads of the out there at the Hurricane Center. I won't name names, but one of them wasn't thrilled with the reanalysis being done, because they reanalyzed every hurricane, I think, back to 1850, and basically dropped every hurricane one category. So if everything is weaker by one category, suddenly you're beefing everything up to Cat 4 and 5. You take your line like this and you just tilt it. So it's all weaker in the past, stronger in the future. Oh, look, they're worse than ever. And their point was people just didn't take good data ratings back then. Let me say something. This drives me nuts, and you know it does because you've been with me on hurricane chases. We're in the middle of a hurricane getting no wind data whatsoever. All the anemometers go down at 85 miles. What are you talking about? We were in Hurricane Laura in Lake Charles. Remember that? And that one now went at 157. So that was, at least that was a legit wind. I mean, that was over us when the winds are nearby, when the winds went that strong. Right. Fierce stuff. But man, we get very little wind data anywhere on the coast about these storms. There's no anemometers up. The ones that are up malfunction. So we're not getting better data. We get better pictures from satellite and radar. We get the infrared. They look really cool in T-shirts and on a screen. But the wind data records Milton was actually a little different, because Milton came up and hit Tampa Bay. And those anemometers in the Tampa Bay area picked up all kinds of readings. That's where I think Tampa was like 109, one of the strongest gusts they've had. But that wasn't even the worst. They've had 2 hurricanes in Tampa dating back early 1900s and into the 1800s. They were probably high in Category 3. That one sent, when Milton hit and it went just south of town, so the water went out. Helene, I think, sent a wall of water about 5 or 6 feet into Tampa Bay. The hurricane of 1821. I'll probably get my years mixed up here. Anyhow, the big one, you can look it up, Tampa Bay big hurricane. It'll show it, Google it. That flood surge was 21 feet high in downtown Tampa. That would wipe out modern Tampa Bay. It would wipe it out. And that happened way before we had even trains operating. So to say that CO2 is causing more storms isn't backed by the data.
Well, that's absolutely true. And so, factually speaking, when you look at NOAA and the National Hurricane Center, their data also points this out to some extent that over that same 10-year period, 2013 to 23, you actually had four of those years were at, I believe, at or below average, and 6 of those years were above average. Yeah. So people might be thinking, see, there more than half your decade is above average. The difference, though, between tornadoes and hurricanes is a little bit complicated. We won't spend a ton of time on it, but you can speak into this, Dad. That when you're looking at hurricanes, there are certain hurricanes, like say back in the 90s, that would not have been talked about. They wouldn't have been named as a named storm because they were out so far in the Atlantic Basin or the Pacific Ocean, they didn't matter. Now we're naming storms far from land that never affect land that they're counting in the numbers of hurricanes, and it's skewing those numbers. So whereas what if they counted all the storms in the 90s? Well, we may have had dozens more storms as part of those numbers, but we didn't because they didn't name them. So all you got to do is change the rules by which we measure these storms, and you can skew the data all you want.
Remember, we didn't have satellite pictures till the mid-1900s. There were no satellite images before.
Right.
So they're a relatively new thing. They're like 70, 80 years old. Okay, that's relatively new in science. And even then, they weren't that good. They were catching mostly stuff near the coastline and stuff like that. We measure every swirl out there now. It depends on who's naming them at the Hurricane Center. And I'm sorry to say this. I mean, I was going to work for them at one time. I loved what these guys were doing, but so many of these agencies are so corrupted now. People call it woke. I call it the opposite. I think I'm woke. They're asleep. Everybody else is sleeping. They're not.
That's a good point.
You should flip the terminology. But anyhow, so yes, they were all these swirls that were out there being named now. Back, say, 100 years ago, the only way you could get data for a hurricane was shipping routes. And the shipping routes were pretty consistent. They were like highways. Everybody pretty much stayed on those. They didn't go outside of them very much. So we missed a lot of hurricanes being named or targeted back then. Today, like tornadoes, we catch everything. We see every swirl that's out there, which is awesome. I love that. But you can't just go naming everything and then say, oh, look, it's twice as bad as it was back then. That's not even credible sounding when we talk that way. And again,
that's exactly right.
People could say, well, why does it get you so wound up? Because you're hurting people with this stuff. You're scaring them. You're raising their rates. You're raising their energy rates.
Yes.
You're faking the economy. You're faking out with all this stuff. And you know it's not true. Again, there are so many people who believe in climate change who are famous, who own property right on the ocean now. Why?
Yeah.
If you know it. And why
so
can
true.
you do that? And most of them got insurance, which we can't get. So I'm not even sure how that works. There's so much stuff that's unscrupulous. It's not even funny. And it's all related to the climate change agenda. Again, someone said this the other day. You and I have said it. I just love storms. I love weather. And it makes me sick that it's all politicized now with this garbage, because it is paganism. This stuff comes straight from dark paganism. The things that it teaches and pushes, frankly, from my end, just take the fun out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd rather be talking with you about the upcoming outbreaks, because I think in a couple of weeks there's going to be another outbreak coming around. And you know how I am with this stuff. I'm very selective what I go after. I'll throw this out there too for people who are more.
And by outbreak, you mean tornado outbreak coming up?
I mean tornado outbreak. Yeah, hurricane season way out there. Tornado outbreak for me, it has to be. It has to be there's going to be a bunch on the ground, and it has to be that I'm going to be constructive being out there, either alerting people or getting new data, whatever I'm doing. And so, as I'm putting these things together, that's what the stuff that gets me excited. But we have to address this stuff so that people, you and I know this, been talking this for decades. But there's still a lot of confused people out there. Maybe a pastor will watch this and go, maybe I should check into this more. If nothing else, maybe that pastor checks into the insurance policy for his house and his church.
That's exactly right.
It's
so true.
If he's in your area, man, that's Tornado Alley. Everybody says it's shifting back east Tornado Alley. I wouldn't count on that. I would. You get the dry line set up in May going out there, man, you could have some monsters rolling through Dallas-Fort Worth. Yeah, make sure you use prudence.
And I just want to point something out with just a few minutes left here that we talk about, we hear about how climate change is affecting the tornadoes and everything. We still have had some of the worst hurricanes in U.S. history prior to the Industrial Revolution. We had was it 1900 or 1908? It was one of those two, and I know that's an 8-year difference, but the Galveston hurricane literally obliterated.
Yeah, it was 1899 or 1900. Yeah, I've got a lot on that. I've actually got
it. Obliterated the city of Galveston. It almost wiped it completely off the map. And there actually was a city near Galveston that doesn't exist today in Texas that did.
Indianola.
Yeah, there you go. Indianola. Yeah. It was wiped out, killed everybody in town, and it was done. Then you had the 1800s had lots of hurricanes. You had Hurricane Camille in the 1960s, I believe it was. You've had a number of hurricanes way before.
Yeah,
of course, Camille was after the Industrial Revolution.
But that was, and Camille threw battleships into the forest.
Into Mississippi. Yeah.
Staggering storm.
And by the way, the worst tornado in U.S. history.
Go ahead.
Yeah, correct. The worst tornado in U.S. history is still now, by the way, hit its 100-year anniversary yesterday. It was 1925, and it was the tri-state tornado, and it killed like 690 some people. Yep. It's still the worst, and it was an F5, and it was only eyewitness reports. There's no video. 1925, right. People said they called it like the black monster, the black beast. Yeah. They had different nicknames for it, like the Indians did back, in the founding era and through the 1800s. But this tornado was moving on average. I think it was like somewhere between 60 and 70 miles per hour.
I was going to say it was breaking the speed limit. There was no way to
It was crazy. People would be freaking out of it.
When you saw that thing, it was on you in about 15, 20 seconds.
Yeah.
That's how fast it was moving.
And this was 100 years ago. Yeah. Nowhere near today. So the point is that tornadoes are not getting worse. Hurricanes are not getting worse. And it matters because...
We know this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Getting back to your CO2 question at the beginning. If CO2 were causing it, then they should be getting much worse. There should be F5s all over the place. There should be big hurricanes. When they're going to do it this year. When they start naming hurricanes in April or May, they're going to go, oh my God, this is so impressive how early it is. No, it's not. I've got maps from 1906 showing hurricanes in May and April out over the western Atlantic Ocean. People, literally what's happening in those cases, you're being lied to. It's just not the truth. Now, what they'll tell me is my old weather maps are outdated, that they weren't actually doing things right back then. I don't believe that, because I believe if you're a farmer or a merchant on the coast, or you're a wharfsman, you're somebody driving, captaining a boat coming in, I think you take your weather very serious, because you could either die in bad weather, or if you give bad information, you come in on your boat and you say there was a hurricane out there, and the other boats stay in and found out you lied all along, there wasn't really a storm out there, and they lose money. Your reputation's over. We don't even care about reputation today. In fact, it doesn't mean a hill of beans to us, right?
That's exactly right.
They took their data very serious back then. I could go into so much more, but I don't have time to dig it. How they took readings off the ships from one end to the other. They dropped them in the water, and we don't do this stuff today. We digitize everything, and it's about pictures and stuff. We have the potential to make the best leaps in science ever seen. We could do that if kingdom-minded people, men and women, are running these things. We could do it.
Man, that's a great way to wrap this up. Obviously, there's a lot more of this conversation to be had.
Oh, yeah.
And bringing in public policy figures to talk about what that might look like, if anything at all. But we just wanted to bring it to our viewers because we believe that this is a pagan-related and rooted religion at this point, and it's affecting people's lives. It's affecting their energy costs, their housing, property costs. Everything is going into this, and there's not enough conservative thinking and Christian church related thinking on this topic to be able to address it. So we wanted to be able to give a unique perspective, not only from a pastoral point of view. I was a sitting state rep in New Hampshire and giving that policy point of view, but also a storm chasing point of view as actual storm chasers. I mean, I still do this here in Texas on my off time. And so Dad, I just want to thank you for coming on and joining us today and providing your expertise and your perspective. If you're listening, we hope you share this episode with everybody that you know around you. And until the next episode, thank you for joining in and tuning in for Liberty and Justice podcast. We hope to see you next time.
Hey, thanks so much for watching the For Liberty and Justice podcast, where we seek to mobilize the church, wake up the city, and take a stand for liberty and justice in the governmental realm. Hey, look, we'd love for you to follow us on all of our social media at For Liberty and Justice. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with a friend. And if you're looking to get involved, we'd love for you to either launch a chapter or join a chapter in your local area so we can keep fighting for liberty and justice together. You can do that by going to forlibertyandjustice.us and signing up today. Let's keep fighting to mobilize the church, wake up the city, and take a stand for liberty and justice together.